interest of time, I'll just get started with the introduction before the presentation get loaded. It's an honor to be here at the India Smart Grid Week 2018. I've been at all the events every time. Whenever I come, it always feels like a first time, a lot of excitement going on here. In the electric mobility sector, I remember for the first time I conducted the tutorial on Monday, and you don't believe how many people showed up, 5 to 7 people. So since then, the last 2 years, the term electric mobility and what India has done, whether it's Niti Aayog, the ministries, etc., is a phenomenal job. And now we see people coming from globally as well as representation from the automotive OEMs coming on board, and it's a very welcome sign, and I'm very excited to see this progress. So my presentation today will primarily focus on looking at some of the data-based, science-based approaches to some of the key issues that the previous speakers touched upon, whether it was Chairman Anil Srivastava, Sajid Mubashir, or Mahesh, or even Doron for that extent. I am from Electric Power Research Institute, a technical executive there. I'm also part of the teaching, is in my blood. My dad was a math teacher, so I'm also part of the visiting professor at the Southern Denmark University, and also part of the ISGF activities, chair one of the working groups there on electric mobility and flexibility. So in terms of giving a context, I think it's very critical to understand the term the grid with electric vehicles. The electric vehicles, you can't decouple the electric vehicles from the electric grid. They are kind of inextricably linked. And this is a vision that we have at Electric Power Research Institute. I won't go into what EPRI is. Matt Wakefield yesterday gave a lot of introduction to EPRI, what it is, a nonprofit institution based in US with international presence. But from the integrated grid, it's very important to understand how electric mobility fits into an integrated grid. Some of the speakers did speak about that, but the important thing is, when you look at a grid can include a lot of energy or electric resources, power resources. And in the terms, the one I have circled here, other than things like solar, microgrids, energy storage, customer side technologies, lighting or HVAC systems, electric vehicles will play a very key role, and it's very important to understand what impact the grid will have from aggressive penetration of electric vehicles, and how it can become a resource to a grid and not a deterrent to the grid. So if you look at why electric vehicles, right? In the United States, one of the primary motivation was to lower the greenhouse gas emissions. So if you look at this chart in the US, this was in May 2016, for the first time, the transportation sector emission exceeded all the other two sectors that included energy generation and energy consumption. While you can attribute some of those increase to the increase in the vehicle miles traveled, there is also a significant push in the renewables, generation sector, as well as energy efficiency in the consumption sector. That's also driving those, greenhouse gas emission down. But the fact is, it's a significant potential that we need to look at. If you really want to go into the idea of lowering our greenhouse gas emission, what US has a target of 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. India has a very similar nationally determined contribution NDCs as part of the climate accord. Electric transportation will play a very important role in addressing those challenges. You can't just look at that independently. So if you look at what does it translate for India, what are the Indian challenges and motivation? This is again based on data. I have included a couple of references in the papers, including the one we have for India Smart Grid Week 2018. That is based on some preliminary analysis. I can't say what the problem is until I see what it is. So this is based on science, and that's what we advocate at EPRI, fact-based, science-based recommendations. And part of that exercise is to look at what is the projection of electric vehicles if we consider India's plan, what the minister in India plan has, all electric vehicle sales by 2030, right? What does that really mean? It translates to approximately around 206 million electric vehicles. Again, this is preliminary analysis plus or minus 10%. India has close to 176,000 electric vehicles. That's based on the National Automotive Board's analysis. But also right now, in terms of the total vehicle registered, if it's in internal combustion engine cars or other vehicles, are close to around close to 210 million. And so this number is very relative to that. So if you have to electrify that and look at the projection we have seen in last 6 years through the Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers, SIAM data, approximately 5.6% projected vehicle growth over a 6-year period. So if you take this projection from 2017 to 2030, how many vehicles would you think would be there on the field, and how many of those would be two-wheelers, and how many of those would be four-wheelers, and how many of them would be commercial vehicles? This kind of gives you a sense that we are looking at close to 20 million plus, or close to 22 million annual sales. This is annual sales, not the cumulative electric vehicles. That's quite significant when you look at if you want to electrify all of these new vehicle sales by 2030 with battery-based electric vehicles. So when you start looking at those through the pledge that I mentioned earlier as part of the Global Climate Accord, India's also pledges to have, reduce greenhouse gas emission 30-35% by 2030 relative to 2005 levels. So that's quite a significant pledge, and you have to start thinking of electric mobility and its integration with electric grid and what advanced technologies and standards can provide you in getting into that route. So if you look at this transformation is just not India. India has started to get its feet wet with the electric mobility, but the transformation is quite significant. As you look at low gasoline prices, even under the low gasoline price era, currently what you see is the price of crude oil. EV sales have jumped 60% worldwide. That phenomenon is quite significant. If we do the trend continues, we do see reduced demand in oil. This is very critical for India because India imports a lot of its oil, and majority of it goes into transportation sector. And even in terms of money, over $80 billion annually spent in oil imports. That's a quite significant thing that India needs to consider by then. And the right, we have the Bloomberg New Energy Finance analysis that says, the cost has been a factor. We understand that from electric vehicles. Any new technology that you buy will be expensive initially, but with scaling, with advanced technology development, and better science and research, we can bring the cost down, and we have seen some of the speakers providing that. So the projection is by 2022, electric vehicles will be in parity with the current, whatever internal combustion engine cars price there is. But I also think that you don't need to look them as independently as the first cost. You need to look at its operational cost as well. Electric vehicles are tremendously efficient in the miles traveled, as well as the cost that you save in your regular maintenance. So those are saved cost over a 10-year period. Payback is quite significant. So the idea there is to is to ensure that the electric vehicles are part of the ecosystem and larger policies that can enable you to get there. So what are some of the assessment methodologies? Because before you start thinking about saying electric vehicles will impact the grid, or whether we even know if electric vehicles can be deployed in the grid and there will be sufficient infrastructure available for power supply in the grid. Because in India, I've been in India, working in India for over a decade in my previous role at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, supporting US Department of Energy. One of the missing elements is trying to do more bottom-up analysis and understand what are the methods and what we need to do to really understand the impact. One of the early study that we did here in close coordination with the India Smart Grid Forum is a sustainability plan. If you want to really have electrification and transportation coming together, what are some of the key things that we need to look from the grid impact as well as enabling flexibility? Then if you start looking at those grid impacts, then you look at two levels. One is energy impacts and second is the power impact. And what are the new DISCOM power opportunities? Some people, but not a lot of people, mentioned about the role of DISCOMs, distribution companies, because majority of the cars will charge their vehicles at homes or at workplaces or at public places, which are all part of the distribution system. So it's very important to understand the role of DISCOMs in this. Then also interoperable charging infrastructure. Some people did mention the interoperability of charging infrastructure. That's very critical to enable a competitive as well as innovative and enabling customer choice. And that's where the information communication technology, cybersecurity, the standardization, interconnection will play a very important role. And when you start looking at enabling value from the flexibility for the electric vehicles, you can't do that value until there's an electric market design that needs to happen. And the electric market design for vehicles is not different from market design. You would have a building participating in a demand response. That also needs a value, and some of the progressive utilities like Tata Power Delhi Distribution Limited, Reliance, Bestcom, et cetera, have done a phenomenal job in working with the regulatory bodies as well as a science-based or fact-based demonstration deployment analysis to show that there is a value. So there is a demand response or a program in Tata Power territory, and the same program can apply to EVs. If EVs are providing those same resources, why not those could be linked together? So if you start looking at those roles and start applying and expanding them, right, from the vehicle grid impact methodology, then you start getting into a lot of numbers and data, and that data and numbers are very critical. What are the sales and growth projections, right? What are some of the key battery capacities that are needed for those? What is the lifespan of those vehicles? Things like what is the market share? What is the charging level? That are needed, and when do they charge? Do they charge at night, or do they charge in the afternoon? All of those factors, and that will help us understand the energy impact and the demand impact. And both of those, I'll walk that into a little bit detail. They're very critical to understand, both from the perspective of the grid infrastructure and preparedness. Yeah. So in terms of able to ensure that there is infrastructure available, and this infrastructure is leading to the opportunities for new technology developments. And similarly, you can also apply these principles into expanding what are the key things that are needed from the flexibility perspective. We applied this methodology in coming up with these numbers that I show you quickly. And without going into too much details, as you can see, if you really go into that paradigm of all vehicles sold to be electric by 2030, there's a huge growth in the gigawatt hour need that would be driven by these electric vehicles by 2020 and 2030. And for each of these sectors, you can look at close to 206 million. That's where the 206 million vehicle came in. And if you look at 795 gigawatt hour capacity and around 8 rupees a gigawatt hour unit price, you're looking at close to $36 billion revenue opportunities for DISCOM, and that's only annual, right? And if you look at the gigawatt impact or the power impact, it's also important because its grid needs to be able to provide that instantaneous supply. But this, I want to mention a caveat. This is if all those electric vehicles charge at the same time, and based on our earlier studies, we have seen around 10% on the grid. So we are looking at anywhere from 21 to 54 gigawatts of generation capacity must be added just to support the electric vehicles if you want to transition them to full infrastructure. This one is also an important vehicle grid infrastructure and grid integration, and that's where the standardization interoperability becomes very important. The charging infrastructure is not independent, as I mentioned, from the grid, because it's connected to the distribution grid and it's connected to the charging vehicles. So looking at that from an integrated perspective is very critical. And if you look at what are the market programs that the electric vehicles can provide, and this is based on the United States experience, and it's not going to be any different once the market gets established in India, is how the transmission system can benefit, distribution system can benefit, customers can benefit to offer flexibility services that could be deployed through electric vehicles, like demand response programs. So if you look at the bottom-up analysis that we did as part of the study, it was funded by the Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, as well as with India Smart Grid Forum, we did a bottom-up methodology. A lot of people say vehicles are more expensive. The buses was mentioned as an example by SRTU. We looked at buses as one of the key metric. You don't bring a bus and say this is how much it costs. You look at how much vehicle miles need to be traveled, what is the battery capacity. So if you design it from bottom up, then you know the cost of buses are not that much. It can be in parity, and in fact, the methodology that we have developed here as part of the transportation study for Kolkata and for the public transportation looks at that as a key approach and suggests that, hey, that current buses can be deployed if we apply those battery sizing methodology and make buses customized for the city-specific and driving route-specific needs. They are even the same price as internal combustion engine car. This is first cost, and the cost that the transportation sectors might save over a period of time is additional. So again, this is like kind of an eye chart, but kind of gives you an idea of what some of the determinants that we got: the policy tariff design, environmental impacts, deployment needs, what are some of the charging standards you need in order to be considered, and business models, innovative business models, and vehicle grid integration. All of these factors were recommended for 3 key public transportation sector, buses, three-wheelers, and ferries. Ferries are very unique to Kolkata, but that model is very relevant because the benefits of electric vehicles are not just purely from the cost savings, but it's also from carbon savings and better air quality, et cetera, which also need to be considered. So this model of very bottoms-up analysis and recommendation of implementation has been taken up by the Kolkata government, or Kolkata city and the West Bengal government to deploy some of the buses taking this model. So this is where India is heading, and this is where we hope India would be heading, because transportation represents a huge opportunity. This is my takeaway in India. For new markets and technologies, that's very critical. Reduced oil imports, reduce vehicle greenhouse gas emission, improve air quality, and new revenue for distribution utilities. So if you start looking at the electric vehicles, the value it can provide as multiple sources, this is a no-brainer that India is approaching this and heading in the right direction, and we look forward to this journey and supporting in this journey. Thank you.